The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Trauma Center burned into Brent Kuhn's eyes as he sat rigid in the plastic waiting room chair, his hands still stained with his son's blood. 45 minutes ago, he'd been the one holding Jake's broken body on the ravine embankment, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep while the life flight helicopter descended through the mountain fog. Now, surgeons were fighting to save his 10-year-old son's life somewhere beyond those double doors, and Brent could do nothing but wait. His phone vibrated. Through the haze of shock and exhaustion, Brent pulled it from his pocket. A text from his mother-in-law, Patrice Keefe. "Your wife's birthday dinner is tomorrow. Don't you dare miss it." Brent stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure the words were real. His son was in emergency surgery. Jake had fallen, or jumped. The park ranger wasn't sure. Nearly 40 feet down Blackstone Ridge during what was supposed to be a simple father-son camping trip. And Patrice was worried about a birthday dinner. His fingers trembled as he typed back, "My son might not make it through the night." The reply came within seconds. "Be there, or you're dead to us." Something inside Brent's chest went cold and hard. He blocked the number without responding, then powered off his phone entirely. In the reflection of the darkened screen, he barely recognized himself, a 34-year-old structural engineer who'd spent the last 8 years trying to make a marriage work that had been broken from the start. The waiting room door opened. Dr. Patricia Morrison, still in her surgical scrubs, approached with the careful expression doctors wore when the news could go either way. "Mr. Kuhn, your son made it through surgery. The next 72 hours are critical. He has a severe concussion, broken ribs, a punctured lung, and significant internal bleeding that we've managed to control. He's unconscious, but stable." Brent's legs nearly gave out. "Can I see him?" "In a few minutes. We're getting him settled in the ICU." Dr. Morrison hesitated. "Mr. Kuhn, I need to ask you something. When you brought Jake in, you mentioned he fell during a hike. But some of his injuries, the pattern is unusual. The positioning of the bruising on his upper arms, for instance." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that in cases like this, we're required to ask questions. Did anyone else have contact with Jake before the fall?" Brent's mind flashed back. They'd been alone on the trail. Jake had been acting strange all weekend. Jumpy, nervous, not himself. When they'd stopped for lunch at the ridge overlook, Jake had said he needed to pee and walked toward the tree line. Then Brent heard the scream. "No one else was there," Brent said. "Just us." But even as he said it, a memory nagged at him. The night before they'd left for the camping trip, his wife Marjorie had insisted on packing Jake's bag herself. She'd also prepared a thermos of Jake's favorite hot chocolate for the trip, which was unusual. Marjorie never did thoughtful gestures like that. And Jake had drunk from that thermos about 20 minutes before the fall. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "I'll let you see him now. But Mr. Kuhn, if you think of anything at all, you need to tell us." The ICU was a maze of beeping machines and hushed voices. Jake lay in the third bay, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, tubes and wires running from his thin arms. His face was swollen and bruised, his breathing assisted by a ventilator. Brent pulled a chair beside the bed and took his son's hand carefully, afraid of disturbing any of the medical equipment. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered. "Dad's right here." He stayed like that for hours, leaving only when nurses forced him to. On the second day, Brent's phone, which he'd finally turned back on, exploded with messages. 14 texts from Marjorie, each one more hysterical than the last. But notably, none of them asked about Jake's condition. They all focused on Brent missing the birthday dinner, his disrespect to the family, his priorities being completely wrong. His best friend Seth Evans showed up on day 3 with coffee and a change of clothes. Seth was a criminal defense attorney with a shark's instinct for human nature and a loyalty that ran bone deep. They'd been friends since college, roommates before Brent married Marjorie. "You look like hell," Seth said, handing over the coffee. "Jake opened his eyes twice yesterday. Couldn't talk because of the tube, but he squeezed my hand." "That's good. That's really good, man." Seth settled into the other chair. "I've been fielding calls from Marjorie. She wants to know when you're coming home." "Has she asked about Jake?" Seth's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Brent said quietly. He'd been married to Marjorie Keefe for 11 years. And in that time, he'd watched her transform from the woman he'd fallen in love with into someone he barely recognized. Or maybe, and this thought kept him awake at night, maybe she'd always been this person, and he'd just been too blind to see it. They'd met at a mutual friend's wedding. Marjorie had been charming, beautiful, attentive. She'd laughed at his jokes, seemed genuinely interested in his work, and made him feel like the center of her universe. They'd married within a year. Jake came 2 years later, and that's when things started to change. At first, Brent had attributed Marjorie's shift to postpartum difficulties. She became controlling, critical, and obsessed with appearances. But it was her mother, Patrice, who really ran the show. Patrice Keith was a former pageant queen who'd turned her attention to controlling every aspect of her daughter's life after her own glory days faded. Marjorie's father, Gerald Keith, was a quiet man who'd learned long ago that disagreeing with his wife wasn't worth the fallout. What Brent hadn't realized until too late was that by marrying Marjorie, he'd essentially married Patrice too. Every decision, from where they lived to how they raised Jake, required Patrice's approval. Family dinners at the Keith house every Sunday. Mandatory attendance at Patrice's charity events. Even Jake's school and extracurricular activities were chosen by committee, a committee consisting of Patrice and Marjorie, with Brent's input politely ignored. The only thing Brent had fought for and won was his monthly camping trip with Jake. It was their escape, their chance to be away from the Keith family's suffocating influence. And Jake had always loved those trips, until recently. Brent, Seth said carefully, I've known you long enough to know when something's eating at you. What is it? Brent set down his coffee. Jake's been different lately. Sick a lot. The doctors kept saying it was just a weak immune system, allergies, stress from school. But Marjorie always seemed almost pleased when he was sick. She'd take him to specialist after specialist, post about it on social media, collect sympathy from her friends. That's her narcissism. You've known that for years. It's more than that. Brent lowered his voice. Last month, I took Jake to a new pediatrician, one Marjorie didn't choose. Dr. Chun. She couldn't find anything wrong with him. Ran a full panel of tests. Jake was perfectly healthy. But the next week, he was sick again. Vomiting, fever, dizziness. Right after eating dinner at home. Seth sat forward. What are you saying? I don't know what I'm saying. But Dr. Morrison asked me if anyone else had contact with Jake before the fall. And I keep thinking about that thermos of hot chocolate Marjorie packed. Jake drank it, and 20 minutes later he was dizzy, disoriented. That's when he fell. Jesus Christ, Brent. That's a serious accusation. I know. That's why I haven't said it out loud until now. Brent looked at his son's still form. But what if I'm right? What if she? A nurse interrupted them. Mr. Kuhn? He's waking up. Brent was at Jake's side instantly. His son's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and frightened. The doctors had removed the ventilator that morning, replacing it with an oxygen mask. Dad, Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. You're going to be okay. Tears leaked from Jake's eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry? Jake, you have nothing to be sorry for. It was an accident. Jake's hand gripped Brent's with surprising strength. His eyes, though swollen, held a desperate intensity. Not accident. Dad, you have to know. Know what? Jake, it's okay. Just rest. No. Jake tried to sit up, grimacing with pain. Grandma and Mommy. I heard them. The night before we left. I couldn't sleep. Went downstairs for water. They were in the kitchen. Talking about. Slow down, buddy. What did you hear? Jake's breathing quickened. The monitors beeping faster. Grandma said you were the problem. That I was the problem. Mommy was crying. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Grandma said there was insurance money. That accidents happen all the time. That if something happened to me on the camping trip, no one would question it. The room seemed to tilt. Seth moved closer, his lawyer instincts fully engaged. Jake, Brent said, his voice steady despite the ice flooding his veins. Are you saying they planned for you to get hurt? The hot chocolate tasted funny. Bitter. I didn't want to drink it, but Mommy insisted. She watched me drink the whole thing. And then I felt so dizzy on the cliff. My head was spinning. I tried to hold on to the tree, but I couldn't. I fell, Dad. But it wasn't an accident. They made it happen. The monitors shrieked as Jake's heart rate spiked. Nurses rushed in, gently pushing Brent aside. Dr. Morrison appeared, checking Jake's vitals, murmuring calm instructions. But even as they worked to settle him, Jake kept reaching for Brent, his eyes wild with fear. Don't let them take me home, Jake begged. Please, Dad. Don't let Mommy and Grandma take me. They'll try again. I know they will. No one's taking you anywhere, Brent promised, his own voice breaking. "You're safe. I swear to God, you're safe." Seth pulled Brent into the hallway as the medical team sedated Jake to calm him down. "We need to call the police. Now." "With what evidence?" "A child's statement made while on pain medication. Marjorie will claim he was hallucinating, confused from the head trauma." "Then what do we do?" Brent looked through the window at his son, small and broken in that hospital bed. Something fundamental shifted inside him. For years, he played by the rules, tried to keep the peace, convinced himself that staying in the marriage was better for Jake than divorce. He'd been wrong, and his son had nearly died because of it. "We get proof," Brent said quietly. "Whatever it takes. We get proof, and we make them pay." The next morning, Brent took a calculated risk. He called Marjorie and told her to come to the hospital, said that Jake was asking for her. It was a lie. Jake had made his feelings about his mother abundantly clear, but Brent needed to see her reaction, needed to look her in the eyes. She arrived 2 hours later, dressed immaculately as always, her mother Patrice in tow. They swept into the hospital like visiting royalty, armed with flowers and concerned expressions that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Where is he?" Marjorie demanded. "Where's my baby?" Brent led them to Jake's room. His son was awake, but had been coached by both Brent and Seth to stay quiet, to act more sedated than he was. As Marjorie approached the bed, Jake's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Brent's. "Oh, my poor baby," Marjorie cooed, reaching for Jake's face. Jake flinched, a movement so slight that only someone watching carefully would have noticed. But Brent noticed, and he saw the flash of something cold in Marjorie's eyes when her son pulled away from her touch. "He's been through a trauma," Dr. Morrison said from the doorway. "He's still very fragile. We're limiting his stress exposure." "I'm his mother," Patrice said sharply. "We're hardly stressful to him." "Nevertheless, hospital policy applies to everyone." Dr. Morrison's tone brooked no argument. Brent had briefed her on Jake's claims, and while she couldn't act on them officially without evidence, she'd promised to protect her patient. Marjorie's visit lasted 15 minutes before Dr. Morrison politely but firmly ushered her and Patrice out. They'd barely asked about Jake's condition, spending most of the time talking about how traumatic this was for them, how they'd been so worried. How could Brent not have kept their son safe? As they left, Patrice turned to Brent. "We need to talk about when he's coming home. He'll need round-the-clock care. Marjorie and I have already prepared the house." "Jake's not going anywhere for a while," Brent said. "The doctors want to keep him here for extensive observation." "How long?" "As long as it takes." Something passed between Marjorie and her mother, a look that confirmed everything Jake had said. They wanted him home, wanted him under their control, away from doctors and questions and protective fathers. "We'll discuss this later," Marjorie said coldly, "when you're being more reasonable." After they left, Seth returned with someone Brent hadn't expected. Kelly Donahue, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a reputation for handling cases that skirted the edges of legality. "Seth filled me in," Kelly said without preamble. "If what your son says is true, we're looking at attempted murder. Maybe more." "How long has he been sick?" "On and off for about 18 months, Brent said. "But it got worse in the last 6 months. I'll need his medical records. All of them. And I'll need access to your house." "Marjorie will never allow that." Kelly smiled thinly. "Who said anything about asking permission?" Over the next 2 days, Brent learned that his life had been a carefully constructed lie. Kelly worked fast, pulling threads that unraveled the entire fabric of his marriage. She started with the medical records, comparing Jake's symptoms to common poisoning agents. The pattern was damning: recurring gastrointestinal issues, unexplained fevers, dizziness, and weakness, all occurring in cycles that corresponded with time spent at home. "Look at this," Kelly said, spreading papers across the hospital cafeteria table. "Every time Jake went to stay with your parents for a weekend, his symptoms cleared up. Every time he came home, they returned within 48 hours. Brent's parents lived 3 states away and saw Jake maybe 4 times a year. But Kelly was right. Those visits were the only times Jake seemed truly healthy." "What about the hot chocolate?" Brent asked. "I had Seth get a court order for the police to search your camping gear. They found the thermos. It's being tested now, but I'd bet my license there's something in it. Probably a sedative or something that affects balance and coordination." "Why?" The question had been eating at Brent since Jake's revelation. Why would they do this? Kelly pulled out her tablet. That's where it gets interesting. I pulled financial records. Don't ask me how. Your wife and her mother have been living well beyond their means. The Keith family looks good on paper, but they're drowning in debt. Patrice's shopping addiction, bad investments, a failed business venture. They've been keeping up appearances with credit cards and loans. I had no idea. They didn't want you to know. But here's the kicker. You have a life insurance policy. $2 million. And Jake has one too. One that you probably forgot you signed. $1 million. With Marjorie as the sole beneficiary. Brent felt sick. Marjorie convinced me to sign those years ago. Said it was responsible, in case anything happened. And something almost did happen. To Jake. On a camping trip where only you two were present. Where an accident would be easy to believe. Kelly leaned forward. But I don't think Jake was the primary target. I think you were. What? Think about it. Jake falls. You're distraught. Not paying attention. Maybe you try to climb down to save him and fall yourself. Or in your grief, you have an accident driving home. Marjorie becomes the grieving widow and mother, collects $3 million in insurance, and Patrice has access to all that money. Seth had been quiet until now. The text messages support this. Patrice and Marjorie were furious that you didn't come to the birthday dinner. Not sad, not worried about Jake, furious. Because you surviving meant their plan failed. If Jake died but I lived, they'd have the million from his policy, Brent said slowly, working through the nightmare logic. But they needed us both gone to maximize the payout. Exactly. Kelly pulled up more files. I also found something else. Jake's not the first child to be mysteriously ill around Marjorie Keith. She showed Brent an old newspaper article from 15 years ago, before he'd met Marjorie. Marjorie worked as a nanny for a wealthy family. Their 5-year-old daughter became seriously ill while under Marjorie's care. Spent weeks in the hospital. The family eventually fired Marjorie, but they never pressed charges. I tracked down the mother. She wouldn't talk on record, but off record. She said she always suspected Marjorie was making the child sick for attention. Munchausen by proxy, Seth said. Making someone else sick to gain sympathy and attention. Combined with good old-fashioned greed, Kelly added. Marjorie learned from her mother that love is transactional. Everything has a price. And you and Jake had very specific price tags. Brent stood abruptly, needing air, needing space to process the fact that he'd married a monster and handed her their son. He'd spent years making excuses for Marjorie's behavior, blaming stress, blaming Patrice's influence, blaming everything except the truth, that his wife was exactly who she'd always been, and he'd been too blind to see it. What do we do now, he asked. Kelly's smile was sharp. Now? Now we give them exactly what they want. The plan Kelly outlined was dangerous and possibly illegal, but Brent was past caring about legality. His son had nearly died. His wife had orchestrated it. The justice system was slow and uncertain, and people like Patrice Keith had money for lawyers who could make evidence disappear and witnesses recant. No, Brent wanted something more final. Something that would ensure Jake was safe and Marjorie and Patrice paid for what they'd done in a way that mattered. The thermos came back positive. Kelly informed him 3 days later. Concentrated sedative mixed with something that causes severe vertigo. Prescription strength. It would have hit Jake hard and fast at that altitude. Can we trace it to Marjorie? Not directly. But I have something better. Kelly showed him a series of photographs. Your house has security cameras. Did you know that? In the living room and front door, yes. Marjorie insisted on them. There are more than that. Hidden ones. I found them when I searched the house. For total, living room, kitchen, Jake's room, and your bedroom. Brent felt violated. Why would she? Insurance fraud, maybe. Or leverage. Doesn't matter. What matters is that these cameras have been recording everything for the last 3 years. And I have the footage. She pulled up a video on her tablet. Date stamped 2 nights before the camping trip. The kitchen, late at night. Marjorie and Patrice sat at the table, voices low but audible through the camera's microphone. Can't keep doing this, Marjorie was saying. The constant lying, the planning. I'm exhausted. You'll do what needs to be done, Patrice replied sharply. We're too far in to back out now. The debts won't wait, and Brent is never going to just hand over money. He's too careful, too controlling with finances. Maybe if I just asked him, he'd divorce you. We've been over this. And in a divorce, you get half of almost nothing. The house is in his name. His retirement accounts are protected. We'd be lucky to get $100,000 in a settlement. That's not enough to cover what we owe, let alone maintain our lifestyle. Marjorie's voice was tearful. But Jake is my son. I do love him, Mother. Love doesn't pay bills. The plan is simple. Jake has the accident. You're the grieving mother. Brent, in his distress, isn't paying attention during the drive home. Those mountain roads are treacherous. One wrong turn. Patrice made a dismissive gesture. $3 million solves all our problems. And if Brent doesn't crash? Then we have other options. The insurance policies don't specify accidental death. Grief can lead to many tragic outcomes. Drinking, pills, another tragic accident. We can be patient. The video continued. The two women planning the murder of Brent and Jake with the casual efficiency of people discussing a grocery list. Kelly had hours of footage, all of it damning, all of it showing a pattern of discussion about the accident and its aftermath. This is evidence, Seth said, his face pale. This is slam dunk, go directly to prison evidence. Which we obtained through a legal search, Kelly reminded him. A good lawyer could get it thrown out. And Patrice has good lawyers. So what do we do with it? Brent asked. We make a copy. Several copies. And we use it as leverage for what comes next. Kelly's eyes glinted. Because I have a better idea than sending them to prison. Prison is finite. What I have in mind is permanent. She laid out her plan. It was ruthless, perfectly calibrated to destroy Marjorie and Patrice in the way that would hurt them most. Their reputation, their finances, their carefully constructed social standing. Everything they'd killed for, Brent would take away. But first, he had to make them think they'd won. Jake was released from the hospital after 2 weeks, but instead of going home, Brent checked them into an extended stay hotel near Seth's office. He told Marjorie it was temporary, just until Jake was stronger. The lie bought him time. Time to execute Kelly's plan. Time to dismantle his wife's life piece by careful piece. It started with the finances. Brent had always been careful with money, a structural engineer's mind applied to household budgets. What he hadn't realized was that Marjorie had been siphoning money for years. Small amounts from their joint accounts, charges to his credit cards disguised as household expenses. Kelly helped him trace it all. $20,000 here for Patrice's medical bills that were actually gambling debts. $15,000 there for Jake's therapy that had never happened. It added up to over $200,000 stolen across 8 years of marriage. We could press charges, Seth said. Add it to the attempted murder case. No, Brent said. We're going to use it differently. He filed for divorce, but not the way Marjorie expected. Instead of a quiet dissolution, Brent filed on grounds of fraud and criminal endangerment. He included Jake's hospital records, Dr. Chen's reports showing Jake's sudden improvement when away from his mother, and a sworn statement from Jake himself about what he'd overheard. The filing was a matter of public record. Kelly made sure it got into the right hands, specifically, a journalist friend who covered family court cases for the local newspaper. The article ran 3 days later. Local mother accused of poisoning son for insurance money. Marjorie's carefully curated social media presence exploded. Comments ranged from supportive to vicious, but the damage was done. Doubt had been planted. People started asking questions. Then Brent went after Patrice. He'd learned from Kelly that Patrice ran a charity organization, the Keith Foundation for Children's Welfare. It looked impressive on paper, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars annually for sick children. But Kelly's investigation revealed that less than 10% of that money actually went to charity. The rest disappeared into administrative costs and operating expenses that happened to match Patrice's lifestyle expenditures. Brent compiled everything and sent it to the state attorney general's office. Then he sent it to the IRS. Then he sent it to every major donor who'd contributed to Patrice's foundation over the last 5 years. The fallout was spectacular. Patrice's charity was shut down pending investigation. Her wealthy friends distanced themselves. Gerald Keith, finally seeing an opportunity to escape, filed for divorce and moved in with his sister in Colorado. But Brent wasn't done. Not even close. Using the hidden camera footage, Kelly created a comprehensive timeline of Marjorie and Patrice's discussions about the murder plot. She couldn't use it in court directly, but she could use it to pressure Marjorie's lawyer. Seth arranged a meeting, lawyer to lawyer, and played just enough of the footage to make it clear what they had. Your client attempted to murder her husband and son, Seth said calmly. We have video proof, medical evidence, and testimony. If this goes to trial, she's facing life in prison. But my client is willing to make a deal. Marjorie's lawyer, a slick corporate type named Harrington, tried to bluster. But when Seth played the video of Patrice saying $3 million solves all our problems, Harrington's face went gray. What kind of deal? Your client signs over full custody of Jake to my client. She forfeits any claim to marital assets, alimony, or child support. She enters a plea agreement for fraud and endangerment charges, minimum sentence, but enough to have a record. And she provides testimony against her mother for conspiracy to commit murder. You're asking her to betray her own mother. Her mother tried to convince her to kill her own son, Seth replied. I think that ship has sailed. The negotiation took 2 weeks. Marjorie fought every point, still believing she had leverage, still convinced she could manipulate her way out. She didn't understand that Brent was no longer the man she'd married. That man had been passive, accommodating, willing to overlook red flags for the sake of peace. This Brent was done with peace. This Brent wanted war. The final blow came from an unexpected source, Jake himself. Now recovered and living safely with his father, Jake wrote a letter to the judge handling the custody case. In it, he detailed years of his mother's behavior. The time she'd made him take pills that made him sick. The way she'd seemed happy when he was ill, posting pictures of him in the hospital for sympathy. The conversation he'd overheard about making his death look like an accident. The letter was devastating in its childlike clarity. No embellishment, no dramatic language. Just a boy describing how his mother had hurt him and tried to kill him. The judge read it in chambers with both lawyers present. Harrington left that meeting and told Marjorie to take the deal. Marjorie signed the papers on a Friday afternoon in Seth's office. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The polished exterior had cracked, revealing something desperate and mean underneath. You're going to regret this, she told Brent as she signed away her son. You think you've won, but you've just made an enemy of my mother. Patrice doesn't lose. Neither do I, Brent said quietly. Not anymore. Patrice Keith's trial began 6 months later. The prosecution had everything. The financial records, the testimony from the family whose daughter Marjorie had made sick years ago, medical experts explaining Jake's pattern of illness, and Marjorie's own testimony as part of her plea deal. What they didn't officially have was the hidden camera footage, but they didn't need it. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Brent attended every day of the trial. He wanted Patrice to see him, to see Jake healthy and thriving, to understand that her plan had failed and her consequences were complete. On the witness stand, Patrice tried to maintain her dignity. She claimed she'd only been trying to help her daughter, that she'd never actually intended for anyone to be hurt, that it was all just talk, just venting frustration. But when the prosecutor played the audio, legally obtained this time, from Marjorie's plea agreement cooperation, of Patrice saying accidents happen all the time and $3 million solves all our problems, the jury's faces turned to stone. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. Fraud. The judge, clearly disgusted, gave her 25 years. Patrice screamed as they led her away, screaming about injustice, about her daughter's betrayal, about Brent ruining everything. But her voice faded behind the courtroom doors, and Brent felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet sense of closure. 18 months after that terrible night in the hospital, Brent stood in the backyard of his new house watching Jake play basketball with Seth's nephew. The house was smaller than the one he'd shared with Marjorie, but it was theirs, his and Jake's. No hidden cameras, no toxic influence, no walking on eggshells. Dad, watch this, Jake called, sinking a three-pointer. Nice shot. Jake had recovered fully, physically at least. The emotional scars would take longer to heal, and Brent had made sure his son had the best therapist money could buy. But Jake was resilient. He'd started at a new school, made new friends, and for the first time in his young life, seemed genuinely happy. Kelly Donahue stopped by that evening with a bottle of wine and a satisfied smile. Thought you'd want to know, the Keith Foundation investigation concluded. Patrice is being ordered to pay back over $800,000 in misappropriated funds. Since she's in prison, they're seizing her assets. The house, the cars, everything. Good, Brent said simply. And Marjorie? Kelly settled into a patio chair. Finished her sentence last month. She tried to reach out to Jake. Brent's jaw tightened. What did she say? Just a letter. Claiming she'd changed, that therapy had opened her eyes, that she wanted a relationship with her son. Kelly paused. Jake tore it up without reading past the first paragraph. I should have. You should have nothing. Jake makes his own choices about his mother. That's healthy. Kelly sipped her wine. Marjorie's living with a cousin in Nevada now. Working retail, from what I hear. No social media presence, no charity work, no wealthy friends. Just a woman with a criminal record trying to survive. It was, Brent reflected, a perfectly calibrated punishment. Marjorie and Patrice had valued status above everything. Above love, above family, above basic human decency. Now they had nothing. Patrice was in prison, stripped of her wealth and reputation. Marjorie was free but might as well be invisible, living a life of obscurity and struggle that would have horrified the woman she'd been. Do you ever feel guilty? Kelly asked. For destroying them so completely? Brent watched his son laugh, healthy and whole and safe. They tried to kill him. They would have succeeded if I'd been 5 minutes later getting to him after the fall. Guilt. He shook his head. No. I feel relief. And I feel grateful that I finally stopped being passive and fought for what mattered. Seth arrived with takeout, and the three of them sat on the patio as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Normal conversation. Normal life. The kind of evening Brent had once taken for granted and now treasured. Later, after their guests had left and Jake was asleep, Brent stood in his son's doorway watching him breathe. The nightmares had finally stopped. The fear had faded. Jake was healing. And Brent had learned something crucial through this nightmare. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be accommodating. Refuse to keep the peace. Refuse to make excuses for people who don't deserve them. He'd been raised to be a good man, to be understanding and forgiving. Those were admirable traits. But he'd confused being good with being weak, had mistaken forgiveness for enabling. Not anymore. Marjorie had texted him once, a few months after her release. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. Brent had deleted it without responding. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't undo the years of poisoning their son. Sorry didn't erase the plan to kill them both for insurance money. Sorry was just another word, and words were cheap. What mattered was action. What mattered was that Jake was safe. What mattered was that Brent had finally understood that protecting the people you love sometimes means destroying the people who threaten them. The next day was Saturday, and Brent took Jake hiking. Real hiking. Not the traumatic memory of Blackstone Ridge, but an easy trail near the lake where they could talk and laugh, and just be father and son. Jake had been nervous the first few times Brent suggested hiking after the accident, but slowly he'd reclaimed the activity, refused to let his mother's attempt to kill him steal something he'd once loved. Dad, Jake said as they reached the summit overlook. Can I ask you something? Anything, buddy. Do you think Mom really loved me? Even a little? It was the question Brent had been dreading, the one he'd prepared for with Jake's therapist. I think your mom is sick, Jake. Not sick in a way that excuses what she did, but sick in a way that made her unable to love anyone properly, even herself. So it wasn't my fault. God, no. Brent pulled his son into a hug. Nothing that happened was your fault. You were a kid. You are a kid. You deserved a mother who protected you, not one who hurt you. I'm glad I have you. I'm glad I have you too. They stood there on the overlook, the wind ruffling their hair, the valley spread out below them like a promise. This was healing. This was victory. Not the trial or the convictions or the financial ruin Brent had brought down on Marjorie and Patrice. This moment of peace with his son was what winning really looked like. As they hiked back down, Jake talked about his classes, his friends, a girl he might like. Normal kid problems. Beautiful, normal problems. The kind Brent had worried he'd never get to hear about. That night, Brent updated the will he'd drafted with Seth's help. Everything went to Jake, with Seth and Kelly named as trustees until Jake turned 25. Marjorie's name didn't appear anywhere in the document. She tried to reach out through her lawyer once, asking about visitation rights. Seth had shut it down immediately. The custody agreement Marjorie had signed forfeited all parental rights. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen money over her son, and now she'd live with that choice forever. Sometimes Brent wondered if he'd gone too far, if he'd been too ruthless in dismantling their lives. Then he'd remember the thermos full of poison hot chocolate. He'd remember Jake's small voice in the hospital saying, "Don't let them take me home." He'd remember the hidden cameras and the stolen money and the casual way Patrice had discussed murdering her own grandson. No, he hadn't gone too far. He'd gone exactly as far as necessary to protect his son and ensure those women could never hurt anyone else. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a year later when Brent received a letter from the family Marjorie had worked for as a nanny 15 years ago. The mother, Virginia Hernandez, had seen the news coverage of the trial. "I always knew," she wrote. "I always knew Marjorie was making Claire sick, but I couldn't prove it. My husband thought I was paranoid. By the time we fired her, Claire was finally recovering. We didn't want to put our daughter through the trauma of an investigation and trial, so we let it go. I've regretted that decision every day since. Thank you for being brave enough to fight. You saved your son. You might have saved others too." Brent kept the letter. It was validation that he'd done the right thing, that he'd broken a cycle that might have continued for years if he'd chosen silence and peace over truth and action. He never showed the letter to Jake. His son didn't need to know how close he'd come to being just another one of Marjorie's victims, how easily Brent could have looked the other way like Virginia's husband had. Some burdens were for fathers to carry alone. 2 years after the trial, Brent met someone, Christy Coleman, a teacher at Jake's school. She was kind, genuine, had no interest in his money or status. She made him laugh. She made Jake laugh. And when Brent finally told her the full story of what had happened with Marjorie, Christy didn't run. She understood that someone who'd fought that hard for his child was someone worth knowing. They took it slow. Brent had learned his lesson about rushing into relationships. But gradually, carefully, a new life took shape. One built on honesty and trust instead of manipulation and control. Jake approved of Christy, which was all that mattered. And one Sunday afternoon, when Christy was over for dinner, Jake said something that made Brent's heart clench. "It's nice having family dinners here. Not like at Grandma's house." "Different how?" Christy asked gently. "Here, everyone's happy. No one's angry all the time. No one's keeping score." Jake paused. "And Dad doesn't look scared." Brent realized with a jolt that Jake was right. He had been scared for years, scared of Patrice's disapproval, scared of Marjorie's moods, scared of rocking the boat. That fear had nearly cost him everything. "Not scared anymore," Brent said. "Not ever again." 5 years after that terrible camping trip, Brent stood at Jake's middle school graduation, watching his son accept an award for academic excellence. Jake was 15 now, tall and confident, with plans to study engineering like his father. The trauma of what his mother had done hadn't broken him. It had made him stronger, more aware, more appreciative of the good things in life. Patrice was still in prison. She'd be eligible for parole in 8 years, but Brent would be at every parole hearing, making sure the board understood exactly what she was capable of. Marjorie had moved again, this time to Florida, and Brent had heard she was using her maiden name, hiding from her past, living a small life that bore no resemblance to the one she dreamed of. And Brent? He'd remarried. Christy had become his wife 2 years ago, in a simple ceremony with just family and close friends. Jake had walked them both down the aisle, grinning like it was his own wedding. They had a daughter now, too, Emma, 18 months old, with Christy's dark eyes and Brent's stubbornness. Life was good. Not perfect, life never was. But honest. Real. Built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by lies or manipulation. That night, after the graduation party, Brent found Jake on the back porch, looking at the stars. "You okay, buddy?" "Yeah, just thinking." Jake glanced at his father. "I Googled Mom the other day." Brent's stomach tightened. "Oh, she works at a grocery store. Looks older than she is. Sad, I guess." Jake was quiet for a moment. "I don't feel bad for her. Is that wrong?" "No. It's human. She hurt you in a way that can't be undone. You don't owe her forgiveness. Do you forgive her?" Brent considered the question honestly. "I don't think about her enough to forgive or not forgive. She's just someone who used to be in our lives. Someone who made terrible choices and faced consequences. That's all." "Good," Jake said, "because I'm done wasting energy on people who didn't care about me. I'd rather focus on the ones who do." Brent pulled his son into a sideways hug. "When did you get so wise?" "I have a good teacher." They sat there together, father and son, survivors of a nightmare that had almost destroyed them. But they'd come through it stronger, smarter, more certain of what really mattered. The path from that hospital waiting room to this peaceful evening had been long and hard. There had been moments when Brent wondered if he'd become as bad as Marjorie and Patrice, if his revenge had made him a monster too. But then he'd look at Jake, thriving, healthy, safe, and know that wasn't true. Monsters destroyed for pleasure or profit. Brent had fought for survival, for justice, for his son's life. And in the end, that made all the difference. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had looked down on Blackstone Ridge that terrible day. But Brent wasn't that man anymore. The one who'd packed a poisoned thermos without knowing, who'd nearly lost everything because he'd been too trusting, too passive. He was the man who'd fought back, who'd refused to let evil win, who'd protected his child at any cost. And as Jake headed inside, calling back, "Love you, Dad," Brent knew he'd do it all again. Every difficult decision, every ruthless move, every sleepless night. Because that's what fathers do. They protect. They fight. They win. And Brent Coon had won. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.